And I'm delighted to see that we now do have a full room. There are very few empty chairs, and our symbolic empty chair for more than 700 journalists who, according to UNESCO's figures, have been killed in the last 10 years is there as our own reminder. Salil just mentioned the key, the essence of what we're going to do in this session, which is to say what can be done by the powerful organisations. We had a brief discussion there about how the media themselves and journalists might rethink their task in view of this new pervasive culture of impunity, of intimidation, which is spreading across wide parts of the world and is not getting through to the public and is having a corrosive effect on people's rights and on democracy. This is UNESCO's contribution to the debate, not only to lead the agencies, but I think to articulate this direct link between the suppression of free speech, with journalists often in the front line, and the suppression of civil society as a whole, which I know is very much in the centre of the British government's, the Foreign Office's own assessment of the situation, which we'll hear about very soon. My opening thought for this session is this, that while the situation in terms of the numbers of journalists killed, harassed, abducted, tortured and killed is now at its peak, and there, as we heard in the morning session, there are many, many cases which we simply don't hear about. You mentioned Yemen, but also Egypt and Iraq. These are not the figures that are coming out of public. There may be many, many more. And it is also it is only the tip of an enormous iceberg of people in civil society who simply get in the way of autocratic regimes and suffer and are disposed of and often not accounted for. So while that has happened, an enormous amount has happened at the international level, what may be called the system. And again, I think there is a big mistake among much of the media in thinking that somehow the UN, the regional human rights bodies and so on, these are all for sissies. The idea that, what good is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the European Convention to me at a roadblock with a 14-year-old with a machine gun or a machete? True, but actually, we're going to hear from this panel that there is another way of looking at it. And to give UNESCO and the UN, and indeed the member states of the UN, their credit, in the last 4 years, since 2012, there has been an enormous focus at international level in the Human Rights Council of the UN, in the Security Council, with a new resolution only this year focusing on impunity, stressing to state their obligation to pursue the perpetrators of deliberate attacks on civilians, that's including journalists in war zones and so on, and above all, the General Assembly resolution, which is elaborated in the World Trends report and in the excellent concept note that UNESCO produced for this year's International Day to End Impunity, which says essentially it is, of course, above all the responsibility of states to comply with their relevant obligations. And again, journalists may not be fully well trained enough to know that these are binding obligations under international law. There are systems of peer review, of naming and shaming. There are also systems of the UN Human Rights Committee taking up individual cases, sending messages to states and exposing them, and states don't like that. No states like that. That area is not well understood, but we will hear about it today. And we have with us Rob Fenn from the head of Human Rights and Democracy Department at the Foreign Office. I think, Rob, if I may, I'm going to ask you to speak last. There are a number of things which we'd like you to catch the ball on. Thomas Hughes is the director of Article 19, which is this country is blessed with an enormous number of very high quality NGOs. And indeed human rights law lawyers as well. And Article 19 does not only the legal work of assessing, advising governments and government organisations, but also practically in the field getting protection mechanisms into place in places like Mexico, which Thomas will speak about. I'd like to start with Joanna Evans of the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre, because really our whole discussion hinges on the question, can international law work? And I would say at the outset that, again, an unseen part of this is that actually we have now more than 20 international courts which states voluntarily subscribe to, from the law of the sea to world trade to the human rights courts in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. And Joanna and her colleagues in the Advocacy Centre have brought many cases focusing on impunity. And they based their cases partly, I guess, on the case law of particularly the Strasbourg Court, which has been extremely formative. The Franz Dink case, the killing of the journalist and editor Franz Dink in Turkey in, I think, 2007, was a landmark case where the government of Turkey was found in breach because it not only failed to protect Franz Dink when he was obviously under threat, but it also failed to prosecute properly. And by the way, in South America and Latin America, the court and the commission there have much greater powers. They're much more interventionist. They have precautionary measures, orders, which they use very liberally, and they are saving thousands of lives through that and through protection mechanisms. We've got to examine which of these responses really work. So I invite Joanna to say something through a couple of the cases that she and her colleagues have followed about the anatomy of impunity seen from a legal point of view.
So I should say as a starting point that ERAC doesn't, or the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre for the Avoidance of Any Doubt, in terms of where it's based, doesn't focus specifically on journalists. We focus on cases which come from former Soviet Union countries, primarily Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Ukraine and Georgia, where there have been very serious human rights violations which have occurred, and we work in partnership with local lawyers in order to take those cases to the international level, usually before the European Court of Human Rights. And within that, I would say that William's right, that the majority, if not all of those cases, involve challenging impunity, starting from, for instance, the bombing of the humanitarian corridor and following the Chechen conflict, the mass disappearances which have followed, large-scale problems with torture and fair trial, and freedom of expression and freedom of assembly throughout the region. Within that, as I said, and as you won't be surprised to learn, there have been a number of cases relating to the freedom of press and journalists specifically who have been targeted. In our caseload, the biggest problems have arisen with Russia and with Azerbaijan most recently. And within that, I'd link back to what one of the other speakers have said recently about broadening out to a certain extent from journalists, because the same problems have arisen in many of these countries, and particularly recently in Azerbaijan in relation to human rights defenders who, of course, share some very similar vulnerabilities and difficulties. As well as the journalists who've been murdered, one of which I'll speak about specifically in a moment. Of course, experienced again a list on behalf of journalists who've been threatened, imprisoned, accused of a variety of crimes, including often treason and espionage, and even certain cases recently that we haven't been involved in, but I've heard about where journalists have been falsely extradited from, in one instance, from Turkey to Azerbaijan, having sought sanctuary there. So the common theme in all of those, which we seek to address, is the impunity angle. And I was asked to speak about one case in particular, which is interesting for a number of reasons, and it's a case of an investigative journalist from St. Petersburg, a man called Maxim Maximov, who disappeared in 2004 and hasn't been seen since. And it's interesting, one, because it's almost a textbook example of the way in which the Russian domestic legal system failed to investigate his case properly and thereby allowed that impunity to reign. But it's also interesting because as he was an investigative journalist, he had a number of colleagues who were investigative journalists who conducted a large amount of investigation, thereby exposing in parallel the failures of the state by comparison to what could be achieved when there was some will to do that. And then I'm going to try and talk a little bit about how we've taken that case to the European Court of Human Rights and what that might mean in terms of some of the questions which William was raising. So I'll try and do as quickly as possible to the context and then lead on to discussion. So Maxim Maximoff disappeared in June 2004 when he was investigating corruption of the local police force in St. Petersburg and the Ministry of Interior. Following his disappearance, his girlfriend attempted to report the fact that he disappeared to the police, and they refused to accept that report because they said she wasn't related to him. Within a couple of days, as his colleagues had been increasingly trying to find out what happened and becoming increasingly more concerned, his mother was flown over from Germany so that she could actually report him missing. The police then accepted the report, but then failed to do any of the most basic investigative steps, which anyone who watched probably a police drama on TV might have taken, let alone somebody charged with investigation of a very serious crime. None of the witnesses who had last seen him were investigating. There were no steps taken to try and trace his phone or his car, and no searches were conducted at that stage. His colleagues, by contrast, did conduct some of those searches, and his car was found within 100 metres of a police post. The police then failed to do any forensic testing of the car. They located, by various means, his phone. They conducted, as best as they could, some kind of investigation into the calls that he'd received in the days before he disappeared. And they, through various means, located witnesses who eventually gave evidence to the police investigation. That one eyewitness who confessed that he had been a informant of the Ministry of Interior and that he had been asked and paid to lure Maxim Maximoff to a flat on the pretext of having a particular meeting. And a second witness who said that he'd witnessed him in that flat where the two officers who were the main subjects of his inquiries into the corruption had killed him, wrapped him in blankets, put him in a car and taken his body off to be buried. All this information was presented to the police, who concluded that because there was no body, there was no evidence upon which they could proceed with the inquiry. Over then a period of 7 years, the inquiry, the investigation was opened and closed and suspended repeatedly, as is standard practice in Russia. Russian investigations when very little is happening. But this case was different again because Maxim's mother was an extraordinarily tenacious and determined woman who pursued at every single level, every type of inquiry which could have been pursued, and exhausted every single remedy which she could have done throughout the domestic courts. And was treated appallingly through the course of it. She came to the Committee for Protection of Journalists for assistance, as well as others, who then came to us and asked if we would litigate the case. And I personally took a statement from her over an extremely long period of time by phone because she had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. In between her chemotherapy bouts was talking me through the evidence of the case, which I was unable to document in order to put the case forward to Strasbourg. The case was filed in 2011. She died on 26th of September 2014, and they communicated the case 2 weeks after she died, which was a horrible tragedy in the case as well, because all she wanted was to know that one court somewhere would be ensuring there was some form of justice for the case. The case has now been communicated. The Russian government has had to respond, and we've replied, and we're now waiting for the court's ruling, having had to argue that the case should be allowed to continue even though the main applicant is dead. And I just want to read you one quote from the Russian government response to the application, which I think is quite illustrative of the difficulties. Maxim Maximoff was a well-known journalist in St. Petersburg, a profession based on expressing opinion which is sometimes in contradiction to the views of members of the public. This is the reason the profession bears a certain risk, and the Russian state cannot be held responsible. So, in terms of what we argued at Strasbourg, we argued that there was sufficient evidence to show that the state was to be held accountable for his death because of the evidence which pointed towards the state agents who had acted directly to cause his death. We may or may not win on that argument because it's a very high threshold, as you can imagine, for those that kind of test. But we also argued, which I think is fairly unassailable, that the procedural limb of Article 2 as the right to life was violated because of the failure to properly investigate this death in the circumstances. We also argued that his mother had been subject to ill treatment within the meaning of Article 3 because of the way that the state failed to investigate that issue, and other issues relating to freedom of expression, which obviously are linked because of his profession. But most importantly, what we tried to argue was that there was also a systemic violation of Article 2, the right to life, because of the Russian state's failure to protect journalists from harassment and threats and death over a period of very many years, and their failure thereafter, which is possibly even more important, to ensure that people are properly investigated and prosecuted for those threats and assaults and murders. And that, I think, is potentially the most significant argument that we're making in that case, and one which could in the long term have hopefully an impact. So in terms of the actual, against the background of that case, what impact can international law have, and specifically in this instance, international human rights within the meaning of the European system. It's not a solution for everything, I'm sure everybody knows that already, but it does offer standards which are fairly unassailable. And it offers findings, and in this case, as perhaps in many others, what victims often tell us is, first of all, a court has listened to them fairly, has given a historical record of what actually happened, and made findings that their rights actually matter. And that in itself, I think, stands against impunity and has enormous value. In many places, it is the only option because the domestic system is so flawed and so corrupt that it is the only place where you can go to and have those kind of standards upheld. And some of our Chechen applicants from the early cases have said it's the only place where anyone has actually acknowledged that we have rights as Chechens. And so in that sense, it really stands as an important role. Of course, there are many countries where this overarching regional system doesn't exist, and in Egypt or Syria there isn't an equivalent to the European Court of Human Rights. And then there's more difficulty in perhaps some of the international mechanisms and how they work, because you're left dealing with a wider range of issues which perhaps are slightly less enforceable to try and encapsulate it quickly. But you're still left, even in those situations, and even in the situation of Russia, where perhaps even if we are successful, that we still have the difficulty of ensuring that Russia implements any judgment which comes through. You're left with the challenge of how you take those legal rights forward so they're actually meaningful and they're more than the paper on which they're written, whether it's actually the convention itself or the judgment. And that, I think, links to the wider political angle that everybody's talking about already. International law can never really stand on its own. It's very different from the domestic system. It can never be a replacement for the domestic system. One of the greatest frustrations in working at this level is when you have individuals who are in prison and you read the court proceedings and you read, for instance, the bail decisions. It's blindingly obvious by any legal standard that these people shouldn't be in prison. And you can certainly prove that in a court fairly easily once you've taken the case and you've exhausted domestic remedies. But it's not just used to the person sitting in prison if 7 or 8 years later you get a finding that they've had their rights violated under Article 5 or Article 6. And the European system, as many of the other international ones, is slow. And as you can see with this case, it's now more than 4 years since it's been admitted, and many others take longer than that. And again, there's no international appeals court. Do you need to stop? Sorry, I didn't realise what you were trying to tell me. Lawyers are not going to stop. Fine. So the final point is just drawing the two together. I think the the diplomacy and the legal aspects. And on that point, I think I'd come back to Peter's case because among all the other people that he's already mentioned, the independent bar were asked to sign a letter in support of your release. And I remember reading it when it came through, and I think it was a very good letter, and I remember thinking all the things in there were true, but I also remember thinking, God, I wonder if this will really make any difference. And so to be able to draw all those things together, where you have the law, the diplomacy, and the media, perhaps is the way forward.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I'm going to say something in favour of your case, which is I was fortunate enough to be at the Costa Rica meeting in mid-October, 9th to 10th of October, which is the main international event in the international court on to preview End Impunity Day. And the stress there among the judges, there were 20 or more Latin American judges because they were in session, the Inter-American Court session. The extraordinary sense you get is that there is in fact a network, there is a fabric of case law from the international courts and the UN Human Rights Committee that I mentioned, even though it's not going to be implemented every time. Without it, there would be no standard by which to judge. And the shame of countries like Russia, they're exposed in this way, is something that is out there before the public. And by the way, the most famous Restrepo case in Mexico, in Colombia, which Thomas might mention, which identified that Colombia is responsible for the government for creating a culture of impunity based on a case where the system had failed to allow a wronged journalist who'd been attacked by the police in order to stop him reporting, and he and his family were threatened and eventually exiled and so on. So that is one of the parts of the fabric of case law, which I think is important to this. Thomas, I'll hand over to you to talk a little bit both about the international standard setting and about your work in the regions.
Thank you. So, my name is Thomas Hughes. I'm the Executive Director of Article 19. For those of you who have not come across Article 19 previously, we're an international human rights organisation that focuses on freedom of expression and information. We have 9 offices around the world. So far, the panel has mentioned 2 of those, and in 2 of those offices we have released reports today on protection and impunity for attacks and murders of journalists, bloggers, and other communicators more broadly. Let me speak very briefly about those 2 case examples before I come back to maybe a little bit of analysis on the data and then what is happening at the international level. First of all, Bangladesh. As was mentioned, we have yet another murder over the weekend, this time Arvind Deepoy, who is the publisher of Abhijit Roy, who was, as you recall, a blogger murdered in February. Since Abhijit's murder, there have been 3 others as well, so this now brings the unfortunate ever-climbing total to 5. Silencing of this nature in Bangladesh is not something new. There are cases going back to, we've documenting anyway, going back to 2004 and beyond, where there has been no prosecution, where some of the investigations have been very flawed, and that has meant that perpetrators have walked free. I was in Dhaka in June. We had a roundtable together with the Minister of Justice. He gave a very clear commitment in front of a dozen television cameras that he would pursue investigations into those cases. We're yet to see what's going to happen. I believe there's 1 case that is now being looked into of the murdered bloggers. The other country I would mention is Mexico. Obviously, features very highly in any list of countries where we are talking about murders and attacks on journalists. We released earlier this year a report on Mexico which documents 227 attacks between July last year and July this year on journalists and other communicators. Of those, 7 have led to or resulted in murders. The most recent was Ruben Espinosa, who some of you may be familiar with his case. It managed to reach international news. Ruben, unfortunately, was also in our offices in Mexico City just a couple of days before he was murdered. This really sets a new, more desperate departure for journalists in Mexico, because Ruben, who was from Veracruz, unlike previous journalists who, when moved out of their state and going into Mexico City, had not been attacked subsequently, Reuben is the first to have been murdered outside of his state. So this question of impunity is becoming bolder and more spread than before. So what does the data tell us? Here I'm going to reach across to another organisation. I'm going to reach across to the data that's compiled by the Committee to Protect Journalists, a close working partner to many of us, certainly to Article 19. They produce a very useful annual index called the Impunity Index. And actually, whilst we think about and talk about attacks on journalists as something pervasive across all countries, endemic, and so on, when you look at the details of this data, it's actually very targeted, what we're talking about. Of the 14 countries in that index, 5 of them, of the countries globally where there are impunity cases, those who have more than 5 unsolved cases are 14 countries. Just to name those 14 countries, we have Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Philippines, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Mexico, Pakistan, Russia, Brazil, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and India. So some very obvious members of that group and some less obvious members of that group. Like the data compiled by UNESCO, of the cases that CPJ is following, 90% there have been no convictions, and 9 of these countries remain in the ongoing list of regular top listed countries in terms of impunity since CPJ has been collecting this data since 2008. Also, as was mentioned earlier in the panel, 96% of these cases are local journalists, so that points us very clearly in a particular direction. Very often, so 4 out of 10 journalists often receive threats before they are taken or killed, and a third of them are taken hostage before being murdered. Of the perpetrators of these groups, according to CPJ, 46% are political groups, and a very worrying 25% are government and or armed forces. So that's a full almost 75% that are related to political contexts. And the majority of these journalists are covering corruption and covering political issues. So the real question is, if the data is so targeted, what is lacking in this picture? Why does this continue? And for us at Article 19, it really boils down to 2 very specific things. The first is political will, and the second one is accountability. Now, the 2 are obviously interlinked, and at the international level, Article 19 is working predominantly together at the national level where we have regional offices, looking at trying to ensure greater accountability and trying to build more political will. As many people will tell you who are working on this issue, there is a very large now amount of documentation surrounding international norms and standards where governments unanimously often agree to endorse different resolutions, whether from the Security Council, whether from the General Assembly, whether from the Human Rights Council, but yet the implementation around these issues is very lacking, to say the least. So an area where we think there is considerable scope for improvement is looking at improving the kind of data that is circulated amongst these international, in these international fora, better using different special procedures. So by that I mean, in the Human Rights Council you have a UN Special Rapporteur covering freedom of expression, different institutions like the OAS, the Inter-American Body, the African Union, the OSCE covering Europe, North America and Central Asia, also has a special, as a representative covering media freedoms. These individuals can receive complaints, but very infrequently they do, and the data is often incomplete. They can request states to submit responses to these complaints. Very often these special rapporteurs are responsible for writing reports, including protection-related issues. There are language and ways to use these reports that can then be used for submissions in cases like was mentioned earlier as amicus briefs. So there's ways of creating soft law out of the reports and out of the data that we can get states to be more accountable around. So I'll stop there and hand back.
Good. Thank you very much, Thomas. We heard quite a lot this morning about the pervasiveness of the chilling effect and the sort of effective, the pre-censorship effect of laws, whether they're les majesté, criminal defamation, anti-terrorism, state security laws. So the states of the world are clearly the prime movers in this, matters of political will, lawmaking, and so on. So I'm delighted that we've got Rob Fenn from the Foreign Office here. The Foreign Office does a lot of brain work on this and a lot of support for work done by the NGOs. It's a critical player in the world system. At the same time, there is concern that a senior government official can say, I think in this building, that human rights for the UK government does not have the influence in government that it used to. And of course there is the rumbling in the background, talk from the Conservative side, even ministers, about the commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights being less than 100% certain as part of the argument of the British Bill of Rights and so on. But this is not intended to be an interrogation system, but we'd like to invite you, Rob, to give the assessment of the Foreign Office on the issue and on the responses. Thank you.
Thank you, William. And yeah, we do try and work with our heads, but I'll say a little bit about our hearts first. And that's because I'm about to read out the statement which Baroness Ainley drafted to Mark today. And if I stumble over it, it's because it is full of track changes which she put there herself. This is very much not something drafted by bureaucrats. And I think that just shows you that for British ministers, I must say that goes for any British government that I have served, do feel acutely that the media, the Fourth Estate, is kind of part of Britain's USP, and we, for that reason, we are roundly criticised at times, but we certainly think that part of the British brand is to value freedom of expression, and freedom of expression one way or another, and I'll say a bit more about that as well, about the priorities of our human rights work, has been at the heart of the Foreign Office's human rights work for as long as I've been part of it, which is since 1983. So Baroness Ainley's statement reads like this. Journalists are frequently targeted by criminal gangs, sectarian extremists and repressive states for their work. When people silence journalists, they often do so with impunity. This year began with a tragic reminder of the threat faced by journalists. In January alone, journalists were murdered in Africa, the Americas, Europe and the Middle East, including the devastating attack in Paris on journalists working for Charlie Hebdo. They were killed for shining a light on corruption, expressing their views and satirizing ideas. Sadly, these crimes were only the beginning this year. What often compounds these crimes is the lack of any attempt to bring the perpetrators to justice. These crimes against journalists are frequently ignored and rarely end in a conviction due to incompetence or the corruption of officials. No one should be terrorized into self-censorship or a betrayal of the fundamental rights and behaviours which are central to our values and way of life. Both the tyrant and the terrorist fear the journalist's pen. This is why the commitment to a free press is an unwavering British value. A free media plays a vital role in a functioning democracy. We mark today to highlight why we cannot let those who would seek to undermine it do so, and that this impunity must end. So that was Baroness Ainley's statement to mark this International Day. She also kind of anticipated some of Thomas's remarks about Ruben Espinosa. She's joined up with the tweeting about his fate. Ruben Espinosa was a Mexican photojournalist. He was murdered in July 2015. Around the world, violence against journalists, photographers, broadcasters and bloggers is escalating. These individuals are targeted for attempting to bring greater transparency, accountability and openness to their societies. More must be done to uphold the rule of law and bring those who murder journalists to justice. Baroness Ainley, Minister for Human Rights, #End Impunity. So I have top cover for declaring that the issues before us today are at the centre of the Foreign Office's human rights work. Last year, before the election, I would point to the fact that freedom of expression was one of our 6 thematic human rights priorities. We had 2 others on top of those 6, democratisation and then ending sexual violence in war zones. We ended up with a list of 8, and nobody could quite remember what they were, and it became a bit of a debased currency saying it was one of our human rights priorities. So after the election, we have reconfigured our human rights work around 3 themes, and I'll tell you what they are. But the main point is that freedom of expression and the key role in that of freedom of the media and the safety of journalists fits rather obviously under all 3 of our overarching themes. So the first theme is called democratic values and the rule of law. And that, I think of that as a sort of British branded bucket for all human rights. We're trying to get away from a hierarchy and just say that the UK wants to work on all human rights. There's a commitment in the manifesto to universal human rights. The second theme is strengthening the rules-based international system. And for those who follow Philip Hammond's speeches, there are at least 3 of them on this subject, one of them delivered in China. And he very much sees our human rights diplomacy within the multilateral fora as a key part of our human rights work. So that's not just the UN, as you, William, have been quite rightly stressing. Also, as Thomas mentioned, the OSCE, very important cockpit of dispute and controversy and diplomacy around human rights and what we've been left with from the Helsinki process. And of course, as everyone in this room knows, I think, Dunja Mijatovic has been an absolutely fantastic representative on the freedom of the media, and her mandate expires in January, and there is a frantic search on now to find another Dunja Mijatovic, and we need one. And it's a priority for my department to find one and try to make sure that we don't get a watered down version next time round. And there's a very heavy, particularly Russian attack on her mandate and on that succession process. The third theme for our human rights work, which joins up very clearly with some of the kind of heartbreaking stories which the first panel shared with us, is human rights for a stable world. So we see human rights and freedom of expression as central to that, as a very important part of conflict prevention, conflict management, trying to at least track the violations and abuses which go on during a conflict, and Syria is perhaps the biggest case in point, with the Commission of Inquiry is not going to stop the war, but afterwards, when it is finally over, there will be a really compelling body of work about what happened. And then obviously after conflict, transitional justice and an attempt to get back to peace and security and prosperity. So the whole conflict cycle, really, human rights has a place there, and my department tries to contribute to that. I wanted to end with some thoughts which were really spurred just now, listening to the first panel, to a question put to it and to Peter Grester's response around the fourth estate, and how it's not just journalists, but we're all not good at putting sometimes the positive case for some of these human rights and freedoms which we treasure. And there's one obvious reason for that, which is that all the negative stuff is so vivid and in the foreground. It's very hard to get away from or find enough time to step back from the violations which are going on, and to carve out a space to make the arguments from self-interest for actually giving your people human rights. And I do think the media in this country and all around the world have a crucial opportunity to help governments like mine, or at least ally with us somehow in a kind of opportunistic alliance, if you like, to make this case for freedom of expression and protection of the media and other human rights on the basis of the fact that it is smart development policy. We're not going to spend all our time on this. I do think the promotion and protection, as it were, the harder stuff, is very important and probably takes up most of the time of my department. But it is also important and necessary to broaden the base for that rules-based international system which I mentioned. There are a lot of countries which were rather sort of disparagingly called the emerging powers for a while. I mean, a lot of them had already emerged, and I don't use the term very often, but I think we know who we mean. The countries who will sit at the top table internationally, who will have the ability to determine whether the rules-based system that we all inherited on the back of the Universal Declaration and other kind of epoch-making norm-setting activity, whether that rules-based system is regarded as a Western imposition and something they want to move on from, or is actually just an owner's manual that belongs to everybody, and it is about how to thrive in the modern world. And I think there is some important work to be done in persuading governments, particularly those governments of great future influence, that yes, this is their owner's manual, this is their rules-based international system, and that human rights and the key role of the media in protecting human rights and exercising and embodying human rights is in their very obvious self-interest. And I think we can try to do this under different headings. In the Commonwealth, we sometimes try to tackle homophobic legislation, for example, on the basis of the self-interest of the countries that are passing such laws. You are really discouraging future investors. You are forcing, say, British companies to operate a human resource policy in your country, which is actually illegal in ours. There are some very strong economic arguments you can make to try and persuade countries to be broad-minded and tolerant in that area. Same goes actually on freedom of religion or belief, which is a whole interlocking series of controversies which play themselves out at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly and so on, tends to be a kind of ceasefire, a stalemate between, say, EU resolutions on freedom of religion and OIC resolutions on tolerance, which used to be called defamation of religions. It would be great to step back from that a little bit, or at least in addition to that, bringing into public understanding the fact that there's a very clear correlation between economic success and religious freedom. It's out there. We need to underline it. I think it would actually be even more easy to do for freedom of the media. I think it is just, and I think UNESCO probably do a lot of this already, so I'm acknowledging the work of UNESCO as another key part of our rules-based international system in making these arguments. And we will try in the Foreign Office to do a bit more of this going forward. I think the key hook to hang it on, perhaps, is the Millennium Development Goals. We've just had really very high-level buy-in internationally to a series of targets which build on the old SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. We now have one called number 16, where a lot of human rights issues are there. plain in black and white in a UN agreement. This is sustainable development by another name. It is smart development. You know, if you're going to thrive in a globalized economy, you need to have a vibrant civil society. You cannot afford economically to declare war on the most dynamic and creative and innovative part of your own population. And that is really what is happening when governments pass laws which make it harder for civil society organisations to organise and for their supporters outside to fund them, for example. This is self-harm on a grand scale by a number of governments, beginning in Moscow very often, but really cut and pasted into legislation right across the world. And it's very sad to see these governments just hobbling themselves and the economic development of their own people. Last point, perhaps, the way we bring this back to the human rights machinery that I work with. I do think the Universal Periodic Review is a big deal. I think it is easier to get things done in that context of peer-to-peer commentary than the sort of finger-wagging approach of resolutions. And I would like to see more done, and I will strive to do more myself to make this case for freedom of the media and the protection of journalists in the context of UPR. This is where governments come to Geneva and freely commit, or however freely we don't know, but do commit. You know, there's real momentum now to making commitments under the UPR process and then being quizzed on them then and 4 years later. So I do think in this way the work of the Foreign Office will, I hope, make good on some of the rhetoric, the really felt and believed in rhetoric of my ministers, and indeed align with what you, William, have been trying to bring us together today to discuss.
Thanks very much. I think, if I'm correct, that number 16 of the USDGs has a focus on access for all and access to information. That is including the journalist role, I guess I have to say. We must have voices from the room. Please, I would just...
International partners to make the case from enlightened self-interest and to make the case from human rights.
Or that amusing that yesterday when the Washington Post reporter got thrown out from trying to ask a question in front of John Kerry as a result. That was pretty funny.
Right, let's have some more common questions. Ed Pittman.
Hi, I'm Ed Pittman from the Open Society Foundation's programme on independent journalism. I guess it's a bit of a question for Tom, but when it comes to protection mechanisms that have been put in place in Mexico, and when we compare them to what was put in place in Colombia, I mean, Mexico's come up as something which really didn't work. In Colombia, there's a protection mechanism put in place which has done some good to protect journalists, though it's become overburdened by bureaucracy. But ultimately, because it focused on the protection element, it left out the impunity aspect. I just wonder, when we look forward to creations and replicating some of the good bits of these protection mechanisms around the world, we really have to ensure that both things really happen, protection and dealing with the root cause.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, Ed, I mean, Mexico offers us an interesting irony insofar as it's arguably, if not the, but one of the most sophisticated state-created protection mechanisms with accompanying legislation, with an accompanying prosecutor, with an accompanying safety fund that's up in the Interior Ministry. So all the pieces are there. What is lacking, I think, in the Mexican context is that aspect of political will. The actual willingness of the government to push things through, the willingness of central government, the federal government, to hold state governments to account, the interrelationship between, in a political sense, between governors at the state level and the national, federal government, and so on and so forth. What I would say from a Mexican case example is that certainly I think it's too early, if I can say that's too early to write it off. There were some initial problems that were very focused on individuals and personalities, let's say, within the Interior Ministry, to be very blunt. Those have now changed. There are improvements in the right direction, but we also see very clear cases, including actually Article 19 stuff, where if you raise the wrong case with the ministry and you push back on the wrong security company being allocated to a journalist, then suddenly you start getting threats directly yourself. So we've had threats directly to our staff because they pushed the wrong buttons, essentially. So that aspect of corruption runs thick through the system itself. But I think the construction of the system is valid. I think it needs to remain in place, and time needs to be given for it to take effect. But in that process, and this applies to all processes, you need civil society to be running in parallel. You need civil society to also have a protection fund, to be watching very closely the cases, to be raising its voice, to be holding politicians to account for individual violations, to pursue that impunity and bring it back to the international level. You need to see that through the mechanisms that exist. So we've talked about the Human Rights Council, we've talked about different regional courts and so on. They're all very valid. We can't expect them to produce instantaneous results. But certainly they do offer the opportunity to regularly and repeatedly, again I would say from our perspective, if you have civil society engagement, to push things along, but they do offer the opportunity to hold states to account, for other states to hold those states to account, to maintain that vigilance.
I'd just like to get back to impunity and the ideas, proposals made inside the UN resolutions themselves, that states have an obligation to protect. They have an obligation to prosecute, to investigate and prosecute. They have, in order to achieve that, they should have a credible, effective national mechanisms that have independent judiciary, national protection mechanisms, which may mean cooperation with media or civil society, which is sort of a new and difficult territory. I wonder if maybe, Elizabeth, you might like to say something about, I know in Serbia, for example, they have one protection mechanism which is not strictly judicial, but they've got cases of unresolved murders of journalists going back to the Balkan Wars of the 90s, and it is a way of getting at the truth again, or the wider role which the Council of Europe is now supposedly focusing on, of implementation of the commitments in the convention through a 2-year program, intensive program, supposedly, to build up these national capabilities and national mechanisms and cooperation with the media and others, rather along the lines that Rob was saying, of sharing the data and common action. What would you say, Elizabeth? You say it without, just go ahead.
Okay. The Serbian mechanism you're referring to is for investigation, it's not protection.
Sure.
And it's
Impunity.
so it's a commission that was established to reopen and reinvestigate the old murders of journalists, and they've had success in that. They actually identified 4 suspects that had previous links with the government and have actually begun. They've arrested them. They're still the trial hasn't proceeded yet, so I can't say it's a complete success yet. But they have made quite a lot of progress. And when I've looked at what's worked in that model, it is a combination of having, there's a certain degree of political will which has occurred because the political climate has changed and allowed this. These are much older cases, and essentially the people that are being suspected are no longer in positions of the clout that they had. But I don't think that's a reason to dismiss it. I think there's a lot of countries where we can bring that kind of justice, bring justice forward. And we look at Sri Lanka, there's a window of opportunity opening there, where there's a new president that's willing to look at some of the cases that, like Rosanto with who cases that have will languished and or perhaps due to the implications of the involvement of the previous regime. So I think it's really important actually to take that as political opportunities when they come, and the UK and other governments can maybe play an active role in front or behind the scenes to push those. So you have the political opportunity in Serbia, and then you also have the a very, very active participation by the media. And then that's combined with this commission is basically media and the police, and they've allowed the media to review the evidence, all the evidence that the police have in possession. And so that combination of having the access to the evidence, but having the media to essentially drive this forward and be watchdogs to this process, I think is what has been the motor. So I think those are the things I would pull out of that. As far as I don't see that much progress in other mechanisms, although a few of us in this room have been involved in trying to push forward development of a mechanism in Nepal, which has some promising starts and is one of the focus countries of the UN Action Plan. And so, Article 19 and other stuff, and others here were part of a mission this year to try and push that forward, and the government has committed to allowing a similar kind of mechanism that would have media participation and the authorities. So I think having those combinations can be beneficial.
Yeah, we're nearly winding down, but I have a question for you, Joanna, to follow up a little bit. In Russia, for example, Rob mentioned Russia as a sort of textbook case, and so did you. One of the things which, in fact, identified by the Council of Europe Secretary General's report on the 47 countries is the disappearance of the independent judiciary, as well as free media. And what is your observation about the potential of those judges? I mean, there have been Russian judges in the past who've done their level best to use the convention as a lever to keep the government up to its standards, but they're obviously came out. Incidentally, I did hear on good authority that there was a meeting of constitutional court judges in Strasbourg quite recently, and the Russian representative did actually cite some of the things being said in this country by senior politicians as to justify their own stance on. In other words, they were talking about the reliance on their own traditions and laws and not on something supranational. Obviously, they were misunderstanding. But Joanna, what is the state of the Russian judiciary in the context of the discussion that we're having of how to make impunity, how to end impunity through the judicial systems?
Well, I don't pretend to be able to comment on the Russian judiciary as a whole, other than Russia. The problems within Russia are systemic, and on the cases which I've worked on, it would seem that if the government wants something to happen, it tends to happen, if I can put it that way. But I think the point you make about the influence of other countries is very important. There is concern, and there has been some time, about Russia withdrawing from the Council of Europe. And there's concern about Russia's failure to implement judgments from the court, all of which undermines the rule of law. And we hear from partners, as well as from actors quite high up in some of the institutions, that it becomes increasingly difficult to try and pursue these matters when countries such as Britain also fail to do the same things. There are judgments from the European Court of Human Rights which Britain has been singularly failing to implement for a significant period of time, the most notable being the prisoner voting rights case. There are clearly threats we all know about to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights coming from this country, and most notably recently the removal of the adherence or compliance with international law from the ministerial code, all of which puts anybody from Britain in a very difficult position trying to advocate for human rights internationally. And so it's quite hard. When I started, I used to be extremely proud of all our systems and things which you could export. I'm finding that increasingly hard to maintain as an international line when you see some of the changes which are occurring, some of the rhetoric that's coming out of this country. So I'm not going to sit here and criticise the Russian judiciary when there are many other problems, I think, probably at a wider level, which could be addressed, which might have a more significant impact and which are perhaps more readily within our hands.
Of course, we have heard very much that local journalists, I'd very much like to hear from you, local journalists in these most troubled regions are the ones who are most, in terms of journalism, the ones who are really out of sight and defenceless. Talk about inequality of arms, they're effectively defenceless, and the laws, these unjust laws, are justifying their criminalisation effectively. Yes, the lady in. This might have to be the last one.
Yeah, thanks very much, William, for asking me to come here, because fantastic panels. I just wanted to go back to what Peter said earlier. Even those places which we thought were bastions of freedom, no longer are. And I just wanted to point out here that India, we're still not talking about India being, Thomas, you told us about India being one of 14 countries where the numbers are really rising. But last 4 months, 4 journalists have been killed. And it's just not there in the headline, but it's not seen as, a habitual offender. And now we are only beginning to realize what an offender it is becoming to a journalist. And journalists, the lack of solidarity because of privatization and other things that have happened, the whole media scene is so fractured. Polity is so fractured. So, we just don't know where to turn to protect these people. So, if there are international organizations that are there making governments accountable, please do come in and do help Indian journalists.
And Salil's going to add one sentence to that.
Just one sentence, just to remind you that Mr. Modi is here in 2 weeks.
Okay. My comment is this, that in these diplomatic battles, which some of us rather spent a lot of our life watching, it was India, Pakistan and Brazil, the countries that you look to as new democracies, who actually caused most of the diplomatic blockage until eventually, in the very interesting case of Brazil, Globo TV actually exposed the fact that their diplomats had opposed this in one forum while telling their own people and their own journalists a different thing. And that actually brought the Brazil government to invite them to an open forum and to actually change their approach in international law. So these things can be done. But I agree with you, Rob. Those countries in the middle are the ones that one has to look to if there's going to be a shift back against this trend towards impunity. We've reached our time, but I'll give you both a chance to have to say a final thought if you'd like to say something. Or both of you.
Just thank you. This is a very important day to mark. I mean, there's a long list of international days, but this one really is fundamental. I think so much of the work to protect freedom of expression and protect journalists is an enabling right for other human rights, and therefore deserves important amount of our time and effort.
Just very briefly, not in response to the question posed or the statement made, but really to reflect it as well. At the Human Rights Council, there are a number of countries which are obviously very influential in terms of the way states vote, but do not act in a manner that is compliant with their national constitutions and laws. And India is very clearly one of those countries, South Africa being another one, and so on. So we are looking to ways in which to engage active national media communities to try and take an interest in what their countries are doing at the international level, but it's very hard. Countries here as well in the UK tend to be very disinterested in what happens at the international level. But my final word would be that we should take heart that the organisation or fora like the Human Rights Council, I think are only so far half explored. We are only as civil society using them to half the benefit that we could do. There are mechanisms there that we should be putting a lot more energy and effort into, and we can hold states to account. We can get this much better known. We can track data. We can follow these different impunity cases much more closely. But looking at the current composition of the body about Human Rights Council, looking at global discussions, maybe Agenda 2030 and the SDGs is a positive sign, but generally is not moving in the right direction. So we have to make the best of what we have, and not sit and dream of new potential institutions. We have to dig in and fight the battles in the ones that we have. And I think there is progress that can be made.
Right, we're up to time. I'm going to give you 3 ideas for the future. I'm sure the Foreign Office is listening as well. The first actually is the media, because in February next year UNESCO will be focusing on media owners, editors and others to get them to understand that it is their role as they're not bystanders in this. They're not neutral. It's not that they're partisan interests. It is that their role is to protect all these rights, and communities themselves are being silenced because of these attacks, not only on journalists, of course, but it is something that perhaps has to be more centre stage in coverage. The second is the Commonwealth. The figures in the UNESCO Director General's 2-yearly report of killings and impunity make dire reading for the Commonwealth. I'll just tell you a couple of them. India, No cases resolved out of 17 journalists killed in the last, since 2006. Nigeria, none, 0 out of 7. Uganda, 0 out of 4. Tanzania, 1 out of 2. So there's a long way to go. And the third thing is, I do honestly think that, that significant governments like the UK, as well as the intergovernmental organisation like the Council of Europe, should take on the responsibility of trying to encourage and help to build these human rights frameworks of protection in the regions that don't have them. I realise that the Arab world is a very long shot. There's some talk about having a special rapporteur, and that is the start. That would be a help. But Africa, the court is desperately in need. They made an appeal at the Costa Rica meeting for more outside support so they can become a properly effective court instead of an occasional one, individual petition and that kind of thing. And of course the Asia as well, in order to reverse the trends which we've heard so well articulated here. But I have to thank everyone for fighting their way in today. Mr. Engida had to catch a train. He didn't realise he had to catch the Eurostar to Paris, so he's gone. The reception is next door, and you're very welcome. I hope you'll come and stay. Thank you so much to all the panellists and everybody here for coming.